How many sermons have you heard lately on the book of 1 Peter? Okay. If the book of 1 Peter just mysteriously disappeared from all our Bibles overnight, would it make much of a difference in the way we teach and preach Christianity? Probably not too much. Also in the scholarly world, it also has been very neglected. And one of the themes for 1 Peter, in fact, it's the only New Testament book that deals with the issue of how does a community of Christians, how does the church function in an antagonistic society? How does a church function as a minority community? Now, that's very different here because the church, the Protestant, the Christians, the Catholics, that's part of the American mainstream culture is Christianity. But from some of you from other countries, Burma, China, Southeast Asia, the church is very similar to this church in 1 Peter as a minority, struggling community trying to survive. So that's probably one reason why 1 Peter's not preached about too much today, because it doesn't fit our social situation. But let me show that the social experience and the social location of 1 Peter's audience is very similar to us today. So that's why I believe that it can be seen as the gospel for Asian Americans. It was written to immigrants, not from Asia, but to Asia, to West Asia. West Asia, or modern-day Turkey, was a very popular place to go. They had many economic and educational opportunities. There were religious festivals. There were health spas. So it was a place to go to. So it did have some economic opportunities. Now, again, let's talk about some biblical geography. What events happened in Turkey, in Asia Minor, in the New Testament? Can you think of any events or people or places? Okay, let me answer my question. Where did the Apostle Paul come from? What city? And where is Tarsus? Asia Minor. Where was the book of Revelation written to? The 7 churches, right? And where are those 7 churches? Asia Minor. Okay, so there was an Asian Christianity in the New Testament. And it was a place where many people wanted to go. But as for immigrants, there were risks and dangers. And that's why Peter was addressed to people who we would call immigrants or resident aliens. Now, let me go to a big thing up. The Jewish population in the Mediterranean diaspora around the Mediterranean was much greater than the people that actually lived in Judea. So, for example, in Sardis, which is one of the churches in Revelation, it had 250,000 Jews living there. You all know about Ephesians, right? Ephesus was a major city. It was the capital of the Roman province of Asia. It was a huge metropolis. So in fact, it's the 3rd-ranked city. After Rome, Alexandria in Egypt, and then you have Ephesus. So Asia Minor, lots was happening there. It was a desirable place to immigrate to. All right, the problem with immigrants in the 1st century was because they were not native born, they had limited legal protection. They were, of course, not citizens, and they could not own land. All right, so That was the situation of the first century. What about 2,000 years later? Remember this phrase, American beats Kwan? Remember Michelle Kwan, the Olympic figure skating champion? 1998 Olympics. She was skating against Tara Lipinski, another American. And so when Tara Lipinski won the gold medal, and Michelle Kwan got the silver, the MSNBC headline said, American beats Kwan. Notice the irony there? And Michelle Kwan was from California, second generation. Again, it illustrates, as we have mentioned several times, I brought the book, Forever Foreigners, right? So Michelle Kwan, second generation, could not be identified as an American. And let's look at some other situations. Stereotypes. This is in the mid-19th century, even before the Chinese, which were the first Asian immigrants in large numbers that came. Due to reports from traders, merchants, diplomats, and even missionaries, before the first Chinese set foot in large numbers in California, this was their reputation. Slaves, coolies, they brought filth and disease. They were a threat to the health of the United States. And then today, let me, whoops. Hold on, let me see. We gotta get the thing. Last month, July 10th, in the Fox News, there was a dialogue, and here is what was said. As bad as Islamic terrorists are, as far as the threat to this country, the Chinese are the single biggest threat to the national security of the U.S. Oh, I can't get it. They have been and they will be a threat. They kill kids with their exports. And they kill kids. The single biggest threat to the United States over Islamic terrorists. This was last month, folks. Still forever foreigners. And then, not only was there discrimination, there was legal racism. In the state of California, my adopted home, there are literally hundreds of anti-Chinese, anti-Asian laws on record. And one of the first was the foreign miners tax. And so these agents of the government would go and collect up to $5 a month, which was big money in those days, off foreign miners. And which foreign miners do you think stood out? The Chinese. So they would go and collect the tax from the Chinese. And because their salary depended on how much tax they collected, they would go and collect it again and again from the same miners. And would you believe they collected enough money that for a period of 2 or 3 years, half of the California state government was supported by Chinese gold miners? Half. That was a lot of money off the backs of these poor gold miners. And then probably one of the most famous laws was the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Chinese were the only group in history that were named as being excluded from immigration. Okay, so this was 1882. It was extended for 10 years, and then it was continued indefinitely. All right? And then, when do you think it was finally repealed? 1943. During World War II, because, hey, China was our ally, and then the Japanese were saying, hey, how can you be allies to the United States when the United States won't even allow your citizens to come and immigrate to this country? So because of this, for propaganda purposes, the U.S. rescinded this exclusion law, and guess how many they allowed to come in? A grand total of 105. So each year that's only could come in to the United States. Now, when do you think Asians who were not born in this country could be naturalized citizens? When could you become a naturalized citizen? 1952. I think a lot of us were alive at that time. So up until that time, no Asians could become a naturalized citizen. So there's a long history of these laws. There was the 1924 anti-Asian immigration law, which pretty much closed all the loopholes. It prohibited Asians from owning land, just like the immigrants to West Asia in the first century. We can also not own land. Although, but we're not stupid, right? So you know what we did? I know the Japanese did this. There's the law that anyone born in this country is a citizen, right? No matter the status of the parents. So the first generation Japanese, because they could not own land, they would buy land in the name of their children, who were citizens by right of birth. So they can get away with that, get around that law. And then another famous order in 1942 after Pearl Harbor, this Executive Order 9066 was the order that made 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry be imprisoned and incarcerated in what was euphemistically called relocation camps. Folks, they were prison camps. They were not. They had guards, they had machine guns, they had barbed wire. They were prisons. And of those 120,000 people that were imprisoned, about 2/3, or 80,000, were American citizens. This was the single glaring time during wartime hysteria that the Constitution failed its citizens. And so it's an infamous law, and it's one of the dirtiest times in American legal history, this Executive Order 9066. It was challenged by 3 Japanese Americans about the constitutionality of this. Unfortunately, they lost in the Supreme Court decision. So those are some examples of some legal racism that we faced. And then violence. There were lots of Chinese miners that were driven out of their camps by white miners because they were jealous. And it was a driving out. It was an ethnic cleansing of these camps because they didn't want the Chinese there. Probably the most famous one was in Rock Springs, Wyoming, in about 1880s. 18 Chinese miners were killed by white miners. So there's a driving out. And then today, a couple of examples. The 1992 LA uprising. Remember that? After the verdict in the Rodney King trial, who was declared innocent. oh, and by the way, you know who the judge was of the, oh, I'm sorry, I got it mixed up. The judge of the O.J. Simpson trial, Judge Ito, a Sansei, third generation Japanese, married a white woman, and unfortunately was caricaturized by congressmen by all the dirty anti-Japanese stereotypes. So even today, that still happens. But in that LA riot or uprising, and I think one of the pictures that remains of that is the Korean merchants on the rooftop with a machine gun or a rifle trying to protect their property because the police did not protect the Korean businesses in Koreatown. They said 2,300 Korean businesses were looted and burned. 2,300, just in LA, just in Koreatown. And I know a lot of Korean delegates here, and you may know people or family members who lost everything because of these riots. And of the total losses in the LA riots, almost half was suffered by these Korean business people. So can these anti-Asian riots take place today? Yes, they can. All right. And then, how many of you have ever been to Ellis Island in New York? Okay. It's a wonderful tour. And what do you see? The Statue of Liberty, right? Huddle masses yearning to be free. And you have to walk up the steep stairway, you know. And you had some guy, a medical person, checking you to see if you can climb the stairs okay. And so these are for European immigrants. And they were processed in a day, most of them. And so at the end of the day, they could depart from Ellis Island. Now, how about Angel Island? How many of you have ever been to Angel Island? The immigration barracks. Angel Island's right in the middle of San Francisco Bay. Is there a Statue of Liberty welcoming the Asian immigrants? No. And in the immigration barracks, for those that have been there, what was it like? It was a prison. It was a prison. The men were separated from their wives, and they were guilty until proven innocent. That's a long story of they had to make sure they checked their identity, that they said who they said they were. So they had to go through this intensive interrogation. And most people stayed at least a couple of weeks. Most stayed a couple of months. Some stayed a couple of years. Several committed suicide. It was a prison. They were on lock and key. There was barbed wire. So I think that's a very symbolic example of how this country welcomed European immigrants with open arms and how they treated Asian immigrants with a prison. Angel Island was in operation between 1910 and 1940, and approximately 120,000 Chinese immigrants came through Angel Island. But however, it wasn't just Chinese. They were all Japanese, there were Koreans, there were Russians, there were Jews, there were Mexicans, all came through Ellis Island. So it really was a multicultural prison. But the Chinese were treated the absolute worst. Okay, so if you ever are in the Bay Area, please go to see the immigration barracks at Angel Island. Okay, so my point is the people that 1 Peter was writing to, immigrants, resident aliens to a new country, Asia Minor, had a somewhat similar experience as Asian immigrants to this country. They also faced discrimination, hostility, slander, and sometimes violence in periods of unrest. Now, when they joined this new religion called, well, it wasn't even called Christianity. It was seen as part of Judaism, Jesus as the Messiah. So when they joined this new community of believers, did it help them in terms of their social status? No, it made it worse. They were doubly suspicious, doubly marginalized, doubly excluded, because it's a strange new religion. And we have to remember that it was monotheistic, and we take that for granted today. But in the first century, that was the exception. The norm was polytheistic, many, many gods. And so you could believe whatever God you wanted, you know. But when the Christians say, well, no, we only believe in one God, that was a threat to the other religions. And the biggest threat was to Caesar, the Roman Empire. The words for Lord and Savior and gospel, those were used for the emperor. It was the emperor that was Lord. It was the emperor that was the Savior of the world. It was the emperor who brought the gospel to the world, the good news. So these Christians had a choice. Who was Lord and Savior? Was it Caesar or was it Jesus? So they were doubly suspicious. They could be seen as a threat because they did not worship the emperor. So here's the titles that 1 Peter used to describe the community: strangers of the diaspora, residents as aliens, and resident aliens and visiting strangers. This was a community on the margins. This was a community that was threatened by outside society. So what was the message of 1 Peter? You have now a home for the homeless. They are a spiritual household. They have a new place to belong. And instead of being social outcasts, they are now God's elect. And in Greek, it's very nicely put. The word for resident alien is per oikos, outside the house, versus oikos, which is the word for house. And ecumenical, it comes from the Greek word oikos, or house. So instead of being per oikos in society, they became the oikos of God. And here are the labels, the new titles that Peter gives them to help them establish their new identity. They are an elect stock, a royal residence, a priestly community, a holy people, a people for God's possession. Once you were not people, but now you are God's people. Once you were not shown mercy, but now you are those shown mercy. Where are these titles from? These are titles from Israel. So in effect, 1 Peter's community, even though they're resident aliens, they're marginalized, they're outcasts, in God's eyes, they're the new Israel. The new Israel. So they continue that tradition of God's people being called out from the world. And I was going to have us have a little Bible study, but for the sake of time, these are the questions that I wanted to ask you. When have you felt like an outsider? When have you felt at home? And which of those titles of Israel do you like the best? And how can your Christian identity help you fight discrimination? Being an Asian American Christian, that's a triple identity. And how you put those three components together, it's all an individual choice. How Asian you want to be, how American you want to be, how Christian you want to be. And we put them all together in different ways. So that's our triple identity. I want to conclude quickly so we can have some time for questions. Again, I want to summarize. Our stories reflecting the Bible. Remember, the Bible did not take place in Europe. It took place in Africa and Asia. So all the folks in the Bible, except for those Roman centurions and the Roman folks and the Roman government, all the folks there were Afro-Asiatics. And in our terminology, they'd be all colored folks. And we share a similar history of being immigrants and exiles. And just as there's a Judean diaspora around the Mediterranean, there's a Chinese diaspora, Korean diaspora, Southeast Asian diaspora, Indian diaspora, Filipino. We all have our own Asian diaspora. And then also we come from a culture of we and a culture of honor and shame, not an individual culture. And I want to end with Jesus, right? I want to end with Jesus. Jesus is the divine immigrant. You know, John 1. The Word, as